On Hee Haw, there used to be a skit or segment called Junior Samples Used Car Sales. And it's the infamous and famous location for the telephone number BR5-49. Now, that translates, if you're not aware of it, a lot of you are already, that translates to 27549. Now, this is actually how the telephone exchange system existed at one time. It was then changed to BR1Z1Z or 271010. Junior Samples Consumer Advocate, saving the public from deceitful car salesmen. And then changed back after some humorous incident involving the IRS or something, I presume. But anyway, this new number had 4 letter combinations only if you were to make letters out of it. For some reason, most of it will not spell out BR, but because 1Z1Z was literally assigned at the time to 1010, and 1 and 0 and were given no notation for any letters most of the time, Z was technically possible, it meant that you had literally no combinations or just 4 extra ones for BR. So it would be literally BR or AP or AQ or AR or AS, and it could have all been BQ, BP, you get the idea. But because it was BR, 1Z, you really just didn't have any other number combinations. The idea was to make it to where it was not possible to make it spell out anything on purpose, and also to make it to where it would be less likely to be turned into some sort of acronym as a joke. The reason for that is that everybody on Hee Haw, just about that was a writer, was a comedy sketch person and figured out people were trying to come up with humorous combinations for 549. Now, BR549, just by BR, had 12 letter combinations. Now, BR549 translates to 27549, the numbers. But if you just did BR, that left you 3 digits to work with, and it had 12 letter combinations that were at least pronounceable, 6 of which were really pronounceable, and 12 letter combinations that would be easily written as something that would be a mnemonic or an acronym or something. And it would be BR Liz, Licks, Jizz, Jix, Kiz, and Kicks. BR Kicks and BR Liz, or Kiz or Licks, BR Licks might have been the jokes they were trying to avoid. However, if you use the numbers 27549, that had 240 letter combinations that were considered easily remembered or pronounceable. And missed jokes that you could make out of that were not used. Now, the implied 2 to 3 digit phone number range made this a number that would be local to maybe a maximum of 1,000 people by being 549, that means 3 digits, for BR being why it's called that. That meant that it was a local number. It would be considered a local to a town and a neighborhood, whatever. And I should be pointed out later on that TV sales of Hee Haw home videos used the 1-800 number BR5-4949. When 1-800 numbers became a thing, it was the easiest thing to do. Just put an extra 49. And I should point out that 549 as an area code hasn't been assigned for use by the North American Numbering Plan Administrator yet. So, 27X anything might sound out as Bridge or Broadway or Browning and Crestview or Crestwood. There is no listing anywhere for what BR was supposed to pronounce out as. How did this happen? When telephone numbers were exchanged, pun intended, verbally between subscribers and or operators for long distance or short distance link-ups, older telephone numbers contained up to 5 numbers, depending on the population in an area, preceded by 1, 2, or 3 letters to spell out as an acronym or phonetically in some way to be memorized for a town, village, other significant name or abbreviation for a local something like a mountaintop or whatever, like PDX might be used. Portland International Airport is called PDX. And it's an abbreviation for a central office or the town or whatever. So BR could be anywhere. Now, if you could find out what fictional state it was in, or actual state it was supposed to be in, for Hee Haw, which is left as an exercise for the viewer, you might be able to figure what the BR stood for. The idea of finding out what is the hometown for hee-haw has been done before. I didn't do the video on it. Someone else did it a long time ago. I haven't seen it in a long time. But there's several, actually really is several locations it could be for the town where hee-haw is supposed to be depicting, which it never was. It was just supposed to be a broad slice of society. And if you're not aware of what hee-haw was, please understand that assuming it was unsophisticated and not truly metropolitan and mainstream America is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. Doesn't matter if you were in a liberal or conservative area, hee-haw was a popular show. It had nothing to do with any of that. You would find conservatives that didn't like it because they felt they were being offended or insulted, because conservatives and liberals can seek out the ability to be offended. You do not give offense, you take offense. And sometimes you have to, prop up offense. So anyway, now the other component of this, besides it being an acronym or whatever for a local area, it made it easier to figure out where a phone number is coming from. That was because operators were human beings. The telephone exchange system or the telephone dialing system was people. Just like the word calculator was the title of a job for humans, not a piece of equipment that sometimes runs on solar power, a couple of batteries, or maybe just part of your cell phone. This was an activity. People would run little plugs and jacks. That's where the 1/4 inch jack standard comes from. Next thing about it is it's convenient to use and print, and can be used, again, businesses would do this, converting it entirely to letters and numbers to spell out something to make it easier to remember. It would make it to where you know exactly what exchange it was going through. So if you saw a car, a used car place, or a repair shop with an exchange number that didn't match yours, you knew probably where it was and how far away it was. If you type in a number these days, you don't know where it's from. The local exchange number, like let's say in the state of Oregon, it's 503 or was 503 as we like to call it, and then the next three digits could be one of 1,000 towns at one time with up to 10,000 people in it. 4 digits is actually 9,999. But that's not how it's done, even though that would make a lot of sense because not every town has an upper limit. And that's not a good way to, assign numbers. For another reason this was used, this reduced errors because you could pronounce words and have them be the abbreviation, and that would equal a number. And it would narrow down the caller's location, and it would allow printing and convenient use in every other way. A lot like people using telephone pseudocodes when we use text messaging to symbolize letters from numbers. It was a way of communicating. And human beings are notorious for trying to make these little Dick Tracy decoder rings out of it, or, if you like, you'll shoot your eye out style. Nostalgically personal community connections or identity, because fewer numbers meant fewer people. You'd grow up hearing Klondike such and such in various states. Just meant the letter K and maybe L or KD, Klondike. Depending on phonetics and tradition, you could use anything you wanted to come up with an acronym, and it would make sense to you. It wouldn't make sense in another state. The number on a phone line for number 1 when dialed would be a single click or a noise. I learned this the hard way by writing my own pulse dialer for the clicky rotary phone thing. I had to write a piece of software to dial a phone that way. And that single click, even though it's used for 1 in 1-800, at the time was a no-no because that click is something you'd hear all the time. Telephone exchange systems were programmed to ignore that. They needed to see a minimum of a certain number of clicks. That's why a lot of numbers deliberately included something in the middle range like 6 or 7. It was unmistakable because the number of clicks could vary, but they were supposed to have a specific timing. And that beat pattern would create what's called a pulse detector train. The first click was for synchronization, and the others would be retroactively added to it. Don't ask. You don't want to build that. Just shut up and be happy with your dial tones. Seriously. Now, because it was a click noise, it was avoided, the number 1. The number 0 was also avoided because it took longer for it to go through, because you had to go and we'd do a lot of clicking noises. Also, because they didn't want to assign letters to it. There's also the missing Q and Z, which were added retroactively, obviously because they should be there, but they weren't used very often. Q and Z were not used enough, and they decided to drop them because they wanted to make it a specific number of 3 characters assigned to each number. 2 through, So anyway, but the number 1 was avoided as the first number primarily. They were mapped mostly to 0 and then respectively 7 and 9. Now, I want to bring up some famous examples. Glenn Miller's Pennsylvania 65000 and Transylvania 65000. Pennsylvania should be PV if you're doing it by phonetics, depending on your language orientation. However, it was PE for Pennsylvania. That worked out to 7365000. That's used for the Hotel Pennsylvania in New York, New York. Still holds the number, and they just have the area code in front of it of 212, which is also the name of a song. Look up song 212. And Transylvania can have lots of different phonetically correct words for Transylvania. TR or TV or TRV. TRV would spell out a number that wouldn't quite fit the standard, but it would be something something 8 and then 7865000. Now, if it's TV or TR, you end up with 8765000 or 8865000. Or you could end up, if you want to push it, as 878 for spelling out Transylvania by TRV. Now, why would they use this? Again, this was because people would say the numbers and have someone else run the dial function. You could have a phone that didn't have a dial on it. You could just clack the thing or hit 0. And that's kind of the way this worked. So let's talk about this. In 1920, just in New York City, 3-letter exchange prefixes were used with 4-digit numbers already. That meant that they had to be phased out by 1958 and 1980. Now, it should be understood that they were doing 3 plus 4 already. 7-digit numbers in 1920. New York City was already straining things to even bother with a system, but it made it to where you could come up with sub-area code stuff. It also meant that you had a bunch of people being employed running the exchange systems. Telephone number range changes over time. An example will be Missouri, Springfield City Directory. Springfield, Missouri had over 1,000 people in 1860. In 1880, they had 6,500 people. And 1890, they had 21,000, almost 22,000 people. 1893, they were using letters, any number, and 1 to 3 digits. That meant that you have 1,000 people local to any one exchange, a 20th of the actual population at the time. 1905, they were using letters and 4 digits. That would be 10,000 people max after only 12 years. After 15 years from that point, in 1917, they had 5-digit numbers as being local to whatever exchange, or 100,000 people. This was indicative of phone user sign-ups and usage, and the number of exchanges that were already set up by digits within the state. 1950, letters and 5-digit standard fixed number set was used everywhere, which annoyed people because then they had to add extra characters or whatever. Those were local to 100,000 people still. And 1958, 2-letter standard and 5-digit standard number combined were local to 100,000 people per 2-letter standard exchange set. By 1961, Springfield, Missouri finally had 100,000 people and maxed it out after 44 years or so. So it worked for a while. And then literally 7 years later, they were using numbers only and everybody was just local to Missouri because it didn't work anymore. Representing an alphanumeric equivalent of a telephone number as a mnemonic phrase or real words or an acronym or phone words is very common. 8675309 can be converted to a set of numbers and letters below, you'll see. And you can find sites that will still convert them. It's also used as a way of encoding messages back and forth to people. Badly. Just thought this was an interesting subject. So what area code do you think they were, and what area do you think this was for Junior Sample's used car sales and eventually his consumer advocate source? Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with it.